Everyone has the freedom to choose their own path. But when betrayal enters a marriage, it becomes more than a mistake. It becomes a wound that must be faced together, or not at all. Few things cut deeper than a man discovering his wife's infidelity with his own eyes. In that crushing instant, no fortune, no fame, no legendary voice is powerful enough to shield him from the humiliation. At least 21 black superstars once ruled the stage and captivated millions. Their talent was undeniable. Their names were untouchable. Yet for some, everything unraveled in a single night. Behind closed doors, the woman they trusted most was found in the arms of another man, and the empire they built began to tremble. Because they were musical icons, they couldn't afford public collapse. They fought to protect their image, their legacy, their pride, using influence, money, and silence to keep the scandal from exploding under the relentless spotlight of the media. From reckless studio parties and secret hotel rendezvous to icy confessions whispered on wedding beds, the truth surfaced in the most devastating ways. In several heartbreaking cases, the betrayal didn't come from a stranger, but from someone closer than blood, a sworn brother, a trusted confidant. Below is a list of affairs that didn't just break hearts. They shattered marriages, destroyed lifelong friendships, and, for some, quietly buried once illustrious careers. Johnny Taylor. Johnny Taylor, the man they crowned the pharaoh of soul, once lived like royalty, draped in velvet lights, thunderous applause, and a love story that looked untouchable from the outside. In the 1970s, he and Gurion Rocket Taylor were Memphis' golden couple. At every award show, every red carpet, she stood beside him, soft smile, steady hand, while cameras flashed and crowds roared. They looked eternal. But fame has a way of hiding fractures. Behind the glittering stage lights, the silence at home grew louder. 3 weeks on tour. 4 weeks without a call. By late 1978, Johnny was drowning, lost in whiskey glasses and the adoration of young fans who fed his ego night after night. What he didn't see was the loneliness building inside the woman waiting for him. Neglect became distance. Distance became emptiness. And somewhere in that quiet ache, another man stepped in. He was only 27. The tour manager. Smooth voice. Patient listener. He offered warmth where there had been cold air for months. No one knew when the line was crossed. No one knew when comfort turned into betrayal. Then came May 4, 1980. A canceled show in Mobile, Alabama. An impulsive decision. Johnny drove through the night back to Memphis, heart racing at the thought of surprising his wife. He imagined her smile when he walked through the door. Instead, fate waited in silence. At 2:17 a.m., the apartment door creaked open. A dim yellow lamp flickered in the living room. Johnny froze at the threshold. The scent of unfamiliar cologne lingered heavy in the air, sharp as a blade. A striped dress shirt lay draped over the armchair, careless, undeniable. But the real blow waited beyond the half-open bedroom door. He pushed it open. Time stopped. Gurion lay beneath a thin sheet, lamplight tracing the curve of her back. Her hand rested on the shoulder of the young manager beside her. Their bodies close, too close, like they had belonged together all along. Her eyes met Johnny's. Then surrender. You thought you could buy love? She said quietly. I've loved him for a long time. The words cut deeper than anything he'd ever heard. Johnny grabbed their faded wedding photo from the nightstand. He stared at the smiling faces, two people who once believed love was forever. Then he hurled it to the floor. Glass shattered across the room like the sound of something sacred breaking. He didn't argue, didn't beg. He turned and walked out. That night, he drove straight to the Holiday Inn on Union Avenue. He sat alone until sunrise, nursing cognac after cognac, trying to convince himself it had all been a nightmare. But when he called his lawyer the next morning, May 5, 1980, to file for divorce, reality settled in like a final curtain drop. What followed was devastation. By August, he paid $250,000 in damages and surrendered the Memphis house. Local headlines blazed, "Pharaoh of Soul falls." Fans who once worshipped him now whispered blame. They said he couldn't even keep his own home together. Then came the cruelest twist of all. In November 1980, A DNA test revealed that his youngest son was not biologically his. The truth crushed whatever strength he had left. Johnny spiraled, deeper into alcohol, deeper into darkness, nearly dying of alcohol poisoning by the end of 1981. His collapse cost him everything. Columbia Records suspended his contract. Radio stations stopped spinning his new singles. The stage lights dimmed. The applause faded. And in the silence stood a man who once had it all: fame, fortune, love, now wandering through the wreckage of his own life, carrying nothing but regret and the echo of a shattered promise. Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass. The black lace stockings in the Hilton parking lot. Let's go back to the night of February 12, 1980. Teddy Pendergrass had just finished a sold-out show in Philadelphia. The crowd had roared his name. The stage lights had crowned him king. It should have ended with him slipping off his glittering jacket in a quiet hotel room, the echo of applause still ringing sweet in his ears. But sometimes a life doesn't unravel slowly. Sometimes it shatters in a single glance. Around 11:20 p.m., Teddy crossed the Hilton parking lot toward his Cadillac Fleetwood. From a distance, he noticed the soft glow of the interior light. He assumed Karen, his young wife more than a decade younger, was waiting for him, ready to head back upstairs. Then he saw it. A pair of black lace stockings hanging from the car door, brushing against the cold concrete. Something inside him turned to ice. He stepped closer, looked through the window, and froze. Karen was straddling the tour manager's lap. Their faces locked together. The man's hand disappeared beneath her dress. They kissed like the world outside that car didn't exist, like Teddy himself had never existed. In that instant, the music died. He yanked the door open. Karen burst into tears, words tumbling out in broken apologies. Teddy didn't listen. His voice came out hoarse, stripped raw by disbelief. "Shut up. You made me look like a damn fool in front of my own crew." The parking lot fell silent. Crew members stood frozen. No one dared move. He pulled her from the car. Her dress slipped from her shoulder. He picked it up and threw it at her feet. Then he slammed the car door so hard the side mirror shattered. Glass hit the pavement. And just like that, his pride and his heart lay in pieces. 2 weeks later, he filed for divorce. The tabloids devoured the scandal. Headlines screamed. Whispers followed him everywhere. But Teddy said nothing. He retreated behind closed hotel doors, carrying humiliation like a weight on his chest. And the story didn't end there. On March 18, 1980, exactly 5 weeks after that night, Teddy drove his Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit through the rain. The road was slick. His thoughts darker still. For a split second, as the car lost control, one thought flashed through his mind. Maybe my life ended the night she betrayed me. The Rolls-Royce slammed into a utility pole. When rescuers pulled him from the wreckage, his spine was shattered. From the chest down, he would never move again. The album was cancelled. Endorsements collapsed. The unstoppable momentum of his career fell into a devastating silence. Karen disappeared from his life. But what she left behind stayed forever, a wound carved from betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak. A pain that no standing ovation could drown out. Teddy Pendergrass had conquered stages around the world. Yet in the end, it wasn't the spotlight that broke him. It was a pair of black lace stockings in a parking lot. James Brown. 7 seconds. That's all it took to watch a lifetime unravel. Have you ever seen your greatest dream collapse in less than 10 heartbeats? James Brown had, and it scarred him for good. The world knew James Brown as the godfather of funk, the electrifying showman who ruled the stage like a king. Spins sharp as razors, screams that split the air, a man who seemed untouchable. He moved like fire and believed no one could ever break him. But the woman he loved most would leave a wound no spotlight could hide. By the early 1980s, the cracks had already begun to show. Painkillers dulled his body, liquor burned down his throat night after night. He disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving Adrian alone in hotel rooms surrounded by young dancers and restless energy. Loneliness turned into whispers. Whispers turned into rumors, late-night band meetings, closed doors, music playing too long after midnight. James brushed it off as jealousy and gossip. He had to. The truth was too heavy to hold. Until 1:15 a.m., April 14, 1981. After a show at the Civic Center in Augusta, James returned to the Marriott, exhaustion and alcohol clinging to him like a second skin. A thin yellow light glowed beneath Adrienne's door. The faint echo of disco music faded into sudden silence. Something in his chest tightened. He tried the handle, but rage surged through him. He drove his shoulder into the door, splintering the hinge in one violent blow. And there it was. Adrienne on the bed, nightgown twisted, a young dancer frozen in shock. The sheets were a mess. 2 lipstick-stained glasses stood on the nightstand beside an open bottle. A pair of silver briefs tangled with a hotel bathrobe like careless evidence. The air itself felt guilty. James didn't move. 7 seconds. Then he exploded. "Get the hell out of my bed." His voice ripped through the room, raw and animal. He grabbed a champagne bottle and hurled it against the wall. Foam sprayed everywhere, soaking her hair, dripping over the crumpled sheets. No arguments. No explanations. He turned, walked into the hallway, and lifted the wall phone with shaking hands. "Call my lawyer in Atlanta. File the divorce. Tonight. And prepare a gag order." By 1982, the divorce was official, bitter and expensive. He lost over $600,000 and a house in South Carolina. The Atlanta Journal ran story after story about the mystery dancer, turning the once untouchable icon into tabloid fuel. The laughter cut deeper than the money. In the months that followed, James spiraled. He drowned himself in liquor, lashed out at staff, and was arrested more than once for violent outbursts. Even his own son publicly said, "He doesn't deserve to be called a man." The crown of the godfather of funk slipped. Shows were canceled. Records stalled. Emergency tours were thrown together just to keep bankruptcy at bay. But the worst damage wasn't financial. It was trust. From that night forward, James Brown never fully believed in anyone again. The stage lights still burned bright, the music still thundered, but somewhere inside, the man who once thought he was unbreakable had already shattered in 7 unforgettable seconds. Rick James. Rick James. If people think scandal had a price, they had no idea how high it could climb until his name was attached to it. Even the disgrace surrounding James Brown paled in comparison to what happened to Rick James that night, when he walked into his own studio and found the woman who had sworn to love him forever at the center of a scene that would shatter him. It was 2 a.m., September 19, 1982. After 3 drug-fueled nights drifting through Los Angeles, Rick stumbled back to his private studio, chasing a bass line that had sparked in his mind. Music had always been his refuge. Even through the haze, he never imagined fate waiting on the other side of that door. The second he pushed it open, the smell hit him. Liquor, sweat, something sour and heavy in the air. A dim yellow glow filled the room. The camera was still rolling. For one long, brutal second, Rick just stared. And in that second, the pride that carried him through platinum records and screaming arenas cracked. On the same gray velvet couch where he had written Super Freak, his young wife, nearly 20 years his junior, was tangled between 2 dancers. Bottles lay tipped over. Condoms scattered across the floor. Vodka seeped across the mixing board and dripped toward his shoes. The studio that once birthed his greatest hit now looked like the aftermath of a reckless storm. He couldn't move. He could barely breathe. Is this real? When she finally noticed him, she grabbed for a towel, eyes wide with panic. But Rick didn't wait for excuses. His voice tore through the room, raw and shaking with fury. "What the hell are you doing in my studio?" The control desk went crashing. Glass exploded. The room fell silent except for the echo of shattered pride. Every eye turned to him, not the superstar, not the funk legend, but a man stripped of dignity in his own sanctuary. He stormed out, down to the parking lot, hands trembling as he reached his Cadillac. From the trunk, he pulled a metal case packed with contracts and contacts, every deal, every safeguard he'd ever built. If this humiliation was going to happen, it would not become tomorrow's tabloid feast. By 3 a.m., his longtime tour manager arrived with 2 bodyguards. Upstairs, signatures were forced onto silence agreements. Checks were written, $75,000 each, for loyalty bought in the darkest hour. No leaks. No whispers. No headlines. But no amount of money could buy back what had just been broken. From that night forward, he never called her by name again. Only that expensive mistake. On stage, Rick James still glittered in sequins, still smiled under the spotlight, still commanded crowds like a king of funk. But behind the swagger was a hollow space that no applause could fill. The drugs, the parties, the chaos, they were anesthesia, nothing more. Because betrayal like that doesn't fade. It brands. And for the rest of his life, no contract, no bodyguard, no silence clause could erase what he saw when he opened that studio door. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye, betrayed by his own wife with a man who openly mocked him. If you thought Teddy Pendergrass dragging his wife from a limousine or Rick James walking in on chaos inside his own studio was the height of humiliation, Marvin's story leaves a far more haunting aftertaste. The velvet voice behind Let's Get It On, the crown jewel of Motown, once stood untouchable, an icon with fame, power, and genius wrapped in one magnetic presence. When he married Anna Gordy, sister of Motown's founder Berry Gordy, the press celebrated them as royalty. Music and empire, perfectly intertwined. Glamour, influence, legacy. But behind the polished magazine covers, their marriage was quietly unraveling. By 1973, Marvin was spiraling. Cocaine blurred his brilliance. Alcohol fueled his paranoia. The tender romantic who could make the world believe in love turned volatile, suspicious, impossible to reach. Anna, worn down by the accusations and constant surveillance, drifted towards someone younger, a guitarist who didn't even bother hiding his contempt. He had openly called Marvin a washed-up junkie in front of the recording crew. The disrespect was public. The betrayal would be worse. On September 15, 1975, after a tense recording session, Marvin returned to his private Sunset Boulevard studio. The door wasn't locked. A sliver of light cut through the darkness, and from inside came the sound of soul music tangled with drunken laughter. He pushed the door open, and time stopped. Anna sat on another man's lap, her dress riding high, her fingers lost in his hair, kissing him with a passion that looked like it had never belonged to Marvin at all. For a few long seconds, he said nothing. No shouting. No violence. Just silence thick enough to suffocate. Then he grabbed a beer can from the table and hurled it against the wall. Foam exploded across Anna's hair and shoulders. The room went dead quiet. Without another word, Marvin turned around and walked out, slamming the door as if sealing the coffin on his marriage. The divorce, finalized in April 1976, nearly destroyed him financially. To settle the alimony, he was forced to hand over the royalties from his next album. The deeply personal and brutally honest Here, My Dear. Rumors that he had been humiliated in his own studio spread through Motown like wildfire, driving him deeper into cocaine and isolation. He locked himself away for weeks, pouring every ounce of bitterness, heartbreak, and wounded pride into that record. When it was finally released, listeners barely recognized the man who once sang about sweet devotion. The lover had become the accuser. The romantic had become raw. And in that transformation, Marvin Gaye gave the world one of the most painfully honest albums ever recorded, born not from love, but from betrayal. Miles Davis. Miles Davis, a jazz legend whose own young protege would become the man who shattered his marriage. Some moments happen in silence, yet explode louder than any trumpet ever could. On the night of November 12, 1968, Miles Davis walked back into his apartment on Central Park West with a heart already fractured. He had no idea that within minutes, it would break beyond repair. He was the genius who reinvented the language of the trumpet on Kind of Blue, the architect of cool, the man who could turn smoke-filled clubs into sacred ground. But no masterpiece, no encore, no standing ovation could prepare him for betrayal. For months, he had drifted away from Frances Taylor, lost in heroin, lost in the blur of endless tours, lost in himself. Frances, the woman who once walked away from the bright lights of Broadway just to stand beside him, had grown tired of loving a ghost. And Thomas Reed, the young dancer Miles himself had welcomed into their world, became a dangerous comfort. That night, when Miles reached for the bedroom doorknob, he expected the familiar, Frances reading softly under the lamplight, waiting. Instead, the door stood slightly ajar, revealing a scene so devastating it stole the air from his lungs. A pair of size 12 dance shoes rested at the edge of the rug. The dim yellow glow traced the curve of Frances's body, her slip fallen low on her hips. Thomas leaned close, his lips brushing her shoulder, his hand tangled gently in her hair. The room was unnervingly quiet, like a silent film designed to humiliate him frame by frame. Miles didn't shout. He didn't plead. He walked in, seized the brass table lamp, and hurled it with such force that the wardrobe exploded into shards of glass at Thomas's feet. The crash echoed, sharp, violent, final. Then he turned and walked out without a single word, leaving Frances frozen on the bed, pale in the fading light. By morning, everything had changed. Frances moved out soon after, leaving behind a hollow silence that stretched across the rest of Miles's life. He disappeared from the stage for 3 months, locking himself in his studio, sinking deeper into heroin as if numbness were the only cure for humiliation. Across New York, whispers spread about the jazz titan whose own protege had stolen his wife. For a man who commanded respect with every note, the gossip cut deeper than any headline. Years later, when someone asked why he could never forgive her, Miles answered with a single line. "I was never afraid of losing anyone, until that night." And everyone understood. The moment that lamp shattered was the moment his heart stopped believing in something called love. Barry White. Barry White became a spectacle in his own home. Imagine a man whose voice once melted the hearts of millions walking into his private study at midnight, only to realize he was the outsider in his own life. On August 14, 1982, the king of Velvet Soul stepped through a door and into a memory he would never escape. He had just returned from a run of shows in London. Exhausted, all he wanted was sleep and a quiet moment to review the books. For years, he and Glodden James had been more than husband and wife. They were a power duo under Motown Records. They sang together, built together, fought together. An empire fueled by passion and ambition. But that night, his study, the room that held his safe, his master tapes, his secrets, became the stage where every illusion collapsed. At 12:45 a.m., he pushed the door open. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow over a scene that didn't belong in his house. Glodden sat casually on the edge of his desk, wrapped in an oversized white shirt Barry instantly recognized. It belonged to Kevin Ross, his personal manager, a man he trusted and quietly resented. Her bare legs rested across Kevin's lap. He leaned in close, pen in hand, calmly signing a check. Ink bled across the paper, each stroke slicing deeper than any knife. It wasn't a bedroom scandal. There were no torn sheets. Just money. Just betrayal. Just the quiet division of everything Barry had built with sweat and soul. Barry locked eyes with Kevin. Slowly, he bent down and picked up a condom wrapper that had slipped from an open drawer. Beside it sat a bottle of cologne he used to laugh at, cheap, forgettable. Nothing felt funny anymore. He snatched the check from Kevin's hand, studying the forged signature, then slammed it back onto the desk. No shouting. No violence. Just silence heavy enough to crush a man. Before he walked out, he reached for their wedding album. He closed it gently and tucked it under his arm, as if it were the last piece of dignity he had left. Months later, Glodden publicly dated Kevin. And Barry? The man who once commanded arenas began to unravel. Promotional deals disappeared. A European tour collapsed. Depression settled in. He gained nearly 50 pounds as the headlines mocked him, calling it Motown's most humiliating spectacle. The voice that conquered millions of hearts couldn't keep one woman or one room his own. Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes. Betrayed on his own tour. Isaac Hayes, the undisputed king of Memphis soul, the man whose deep, velvet voice defined the 1970s, was admired not only for his timeless music, but for what many believed was a rock-solid marriage to minion Harley Hayes, his trusted wife and backstage manager. To the world, they were unbreakable. But on the night of March 16, 1973, that illusion collapsed. At exactly 12:20 a.m., Isaac returned to his room at the Statler Hilton in Detroit after a sold-out show. The hallway was quiet. The crowd's roar had faded. But the moment he pushed open the door, his world stopped. Scattered across the carpet were 2 concert tickets, signed in his own hand, lying beside a velvet, wine-colored jacket he instantly recognized. It belonged to Jerome, the guitarist he once called his brother. The air was heavy, brandy lingering in the room, cigarette smoke curling in the silence. And then he saw them. On the sofa, Minion knelt, her nightgown slipping, her hair undone. Jerome leaned close, kissing her neck, one hand gripping an unsigned check. From the cassette player, as if mocking him, Isaac's own voice filled the room, "Walk On By." A song he had written for her. Now it played like a cruel anthem to his humiliation. Minion looked up. Her voice trembled, but her words were ice. "You can write 100 songs, but you can't write one warm night." Something inside him shattered. Isaac stepped forward, yanked open a drawer, pulled out a thick tour contract, and tore it clean in half. The paper hit the floor like a final verdict. 2 months later, Minion moved out. Whispers spread across Memphis about the night Isaac Hayes was betrayed in his own tour hotel. The scandal pushed him into a spiral of depression. He abandoned a new album, cut off contact with his band for 6 months, and watched his career stumble, revenues dropping nearly 40%. The damage didn't stop there. His family fractured, and his daughter made the painful decision to sever ties with her mother forever. For a man whose voice once commanded arenas, the deepest silence he ever faced was the one that followed that night. David Ruffin. David Ruffin. A bathrobe on the bed, and a wound that would never heal. On the night of November 22, 1969, David Ruffin, the golden voice of the Temptations, the soul icon of the 60s, the man whose voice made My Girl immortal, stumbled back to his Detroit apartment after losing a poker game and nearly draining a bottle of whiskey. The city lights blurred behind him. His pride already bruised. But he had no idea that the next few steps would shatter far more than his ego. He unlocked the door. A gray man's bathrobe hung loosely from the doorknob. The air carried the sharp scent of a stranger's cigarette. On the vanity, tangled between Jenna's makeup, lay a torn condom wrapper, careless, undeniable. His chest tightened. He pushed open the bedroom door. And froze. Jenna sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a robe that wasn't her husband's. Her hair was messy, her eyes wide with panic. Beside her stood the Temptations' young drummer, someone David once treated like a kid brother. The young man's head was bowed, hands shaking as he fumbled with the buttons of his pants. Silence swallowed the room. David said nothing. Not a word. He simply turned away, the whiskey bottle slipping from his hand, crashing against the floor, glass exploding like the sound of his own heart breaking. But the betrayal didn't end there. Later that same year, he was fired from the group he helped make legendary. The voice that defined a generation was suddenly alone. Addiction tightened its grip. Depression followed. And the shame of being betrayed in his own bedroom became a scar he carried for the rest of his life. Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield. The moment no one talks about. Backstage at Soul Train, the man hailed as the conscience of American soul discovered that even brilliance can't shield you from betrayal. On the night of September 12, 1975, just minutes before showtime, Curtis walked quietly into the dressing area and stopped cold. His wife stood close, too close, to a young saxophone player who had recently joined the band. The musician's hand traced slowly down the back of her dress as she leaned in, whispering something that made them both laugh. They had no idea Curtis was standing less than 10 feet away. An assistant later said he didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply froze. His face drained of color. After a long, heavy silence, he placed his handkerchief carefully on the makeup table and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You know what you're doing." Then he turned and walked out. The crew stood there, stunned. No one moved. No one spoke. In the days that followed, Curtis quietly canceled 3 sold-out shows in New Orleans, walking away from nearly $80,000 in deposits. Though they never publicly divorced, friends say they lived in separate bedrooms for the final 12 years of his life, 2 people under one roof, separated by something far deeper than walls. And when Curtis was left paralyzed after a tragic stage accident in 1990, she remained by his side. Faithful, present, devoted. But those who knew them say one thing was certain: no one ever heard them mention that night backstage again. It became a silent scar. A wound too deep for even the poet of soul to put into words. For Bobby Womack, the scandal didn't end with just one affair. In 1970, after the explosive revelation of his relationship with his wife's stepdaughter, many believed he had already fallen as far as a man could fall. Even Bobby himself may have thought he'd hit rock bottom. But rock bottom had a basement. Just 2 months later, Barbara Cook uncovered something even more damaging: hard proof. A hotel bill from Chicago. Suite 503. 2 nights. Booked under Bobby's name. And not alone. The records showed he had stayed there with a young female tour manager, 15 years younger than him. When Barbara confronted him, she didn't scream at first. She simply threw the stack of papers onto the floor and asked one question: "How many more times are you going to lie to me?" Bobby shouted denials. Swore it wasn't what it looked like. But Barbara didn't argue. She gave him a tired, almost broken smile, then walked to the wardrobe and pulled out a small handgun. Friends in the house had to physically hold her arm for nearly 20 minutes, begging her to put the weapon down before something irreversible happened. 3 days later, it was over. Barbara filed for divorce, demanding $250,000 in compensation, an enormous amount of money in 1970. The fallout didn't stop at home. The Temptations cut him from performance contracts at Motown, stripping away nearly 70% of his income in 1971. The press didn't hold back. Headlines branded it the most shameful stain of Bobby Womack's career, a public collapse that overshadowed even his immense musical talent. And for a man who once stood at the height of soul music royalty, the fall was devastatingly loud. Ray Charles, the blind genius who could make a piano confess and a nation feel, knew the sound of heartbreak better than most. They say betrayal is sharpest when it strikes in silence, and for a man who lived by his ears, that silence was deafening. In the late 1960s, after months on the road, he returned to Georgia with a simple dream: to surprise the wife and children he'd been missing. Home was supposed to be warmth, familiar. But that night, as his fingers traced the railing he knew by memory, an unfamiliar sound cut through the quiet: laughter. Intimate. Wrong. In the soft yellow glow of the living room, Della sat in an armchair, her dress resting high above her knees, her hand locked with a young man Ray had never heard breathe before. They say he didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't break anything. He simply stood there, motionless, like a statue carved from silence. Then he turned, slow and dignified, and closed the door behind him. By morning, lawyers replaced love. More than $500,000 in assets and 3 houses were divided with clinical precision. No screaming. No public scandal. Just signatures. And from that day on, he never spoke her name again. Later, he confided to a friend, his voice steady but hollow. The most painful thing isn't not seeing, it's hearing your heart break so clearly. Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson. The crystal champagne glass. A hand resting too comfortably on his wife's thigh. For years, he was the golden voice of Motown. Smooth, romantic, untouchable. But in the early 1980s, even the man who wrote the soundtrack to Love began to realize he might have misunderstood happiness. Whispers started circulating. People said Claudette Robinson, his wife, his partner through the brightest days of fame, had grown a little too close to the Miracles' young drummer. Rumors are one thing. Seeing is another. Late one night, Smokey decided he needed the truth. He quietly pushed open a dressing room door. Inside, Claudette sat on the makeup table, her red velvet dress drawn high over her thighs. The drummer stood close, one hand resting on her knee, the other lifting a glass of champagne. Their soft laughter filled the room. In that instant, Smokey felt it, a blow straight to the chest. He didn't storm in. He didn't shout. He simply closed the door and walked away. Then he drove for hours through the cold, rain-soaked streets of Detroit, alone with the silence. They stayed together 4 more years. No screaming matches. No public scandals. Just a quiet emptiness where love used to live. Then one gray, rainy afternoon, Claudette packed her things and left the house that once held their memories. In his memoir, Smokey later confessed, "I could write hundreds of love songs, but I didn't have the courage to keep that woman." Sam Cooke once had to hire a private investigator to follow his own wife. And then fate turned the spotlight back on him. This was a man who stood before roaring crowds with effortless swagger, who believed fame was armor, untouchable and absolute. But by 1963, the late nights, the whispered suspicions, the growing distance at home pushed him to spend $2,000 on something he already feared he knew, the truth. For a month, a detective trailed her through quiet lobbies and shadowed hallways. Then came the envelope. Just one photograph. That was all it took. Barbara, wrapped in a cream-colored fur coat, holding a Chicago hotel room key. Standing beside her was the tour manager Sam once called a brother. That night, Sam didn't go home. He sat alone in the darkened recording studio, the lights off, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. Over and over, he played "Bring It On Home to Me," as if the song might answer a question his heart already understood. From that moment until he was shot dead in 1964, their marriage became a quiet prison. They shared a bed. They shared a kitchen. They shared a humiliation so heavy it never needed to be spoken aloud. At his funeral, friends said Barbara wept uncontrollably, but no one could say for certain whether those tears were for the man she lost, or for the love she had already broken. Bill Withers. Cruise tickets. Champagne on ice. Words sharp enough to kill trust in a single breath. But maybe the cruelest tragedy isn't failure, it's betrayal by the one person you loved the most. Bill Withers, the former street sweeper who rose to fame with Ain't No Sunshine, still believed that Denise Nicholas was a miracle he never quite deserved. She was brilliant, glamorous, an Emmy-winning star. He was quiet, grounded, grateful. But behind the spotlight and success, the cracks began to show, especially when money and ego started whispering louder than love. During the long nights when Bill was in the studio recording adjustments to exhaustion, Denise was often nowhere to be found. He told himself she was busy. He told himself love required patience. Then came the morning of May 21, 1974. Bill walked into his lawyer's office to sign papers, transferring the rights of a song he wanted his son to inherit. The door was slightly ajar. Inside was a scene that would split his life in two. Denise sat on a polished ebony desk, silk dress slipping effortlessly over her skin, her leg draped over the back of Leonard, the very lawyer who had once helped Bill climb out of poverty. On the table beside them, a bottle of Dom Perignon, a silver ring box engraved with Forever, and 2 Caribbean cruise tickets dated for Bill and Denise's wedding anniversary. Denise didn't flinch. She looked at him calmly and said, almost gently, "You're not enough for me to turn down a real man." Bill didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He simply placed his pen on the desk and walked out. After the divorce, the silence was louder than any applause he had ever heard. He drank until his liver swelled. He poured his pain into music, channeling heartbreak into the raw ache of Use Me, a song that felt less like a hit and more like a confession. Years later, Denise remarried. Leonard eventually went bankrupt. And Bill? He would sometimes sit alone, head resting against his old manuscripts, whispering words that carried more sorrow than anger. "You said I wasn't enough, but you were the one who needed more." A legend on stage. A broken man behind the curtain. Eddie Kendricks. The moment when an idol realizes the applause can turn into silence. If Bill Withers shattered at the sight of his wife signing cruise tickets with another man, Eddie Kendricks, the angelic falsetto behind The Temptations, was wounded somewhere he believed was untouchable, the fan club office he built with his own hands, a place meant to protect the bond between him and the people who loved him most. On the afternoon of August 3, 1970, Eddie slipped quietly back into Detroit. He didn't come for fame. He didn't come for headlines. He came to sign thank you letters for sick young fans who found comfort in his voice. But when the door swung open, what he saw cut deeper than any tabloid ever could. Patricia, dressed in a short blue dress, lounged across the reception desk. her hand curled around the neck of the fan club manager, a man who once trembled with tears just meeting Eddie. Scattered across the floor were unopened fan letters. On top lay a Polaroid, Patricia sitting in the man's lap, her dress hiked high, a giant poster of Eddie's smiling face looming behind them like a silent witness. She glanced over her shoulder, her words sharp and merciless. "You're just their illusion. I need a real man." Eddie slowly set down the pen engraved with his name, the symbol of everything he had built, and walked out to the sound of suffocating laughter echoing behind him. Weeks later, he announced he was leaving the Temptations. He disappeared into a darkened apartment, shutting out the world for months. The newspapers never printed the real reason that golden voice faded from the spotlight. But sometimes, it isn't fame that breaks a legend. It's betrayal in the one place he thought was safe. Gil Scott-Heron. Gil Scott-Heron, the kiss on the sidewalk. But Eddie's tragedy was only the opening act to a far deeper humiliation in Gil Scott-Heron's life. Known as the godfather of spoken word, Gil carried the weight of a generation in his voice. Yet in his private world, he placed unwavering trust in one person, his longtime partner, Brenda. Brenda was a social journalist, sharp and perceptive, the only one who seemed to understand the loneliness behind his brilliance, and the quiet addiction he tried so hard to hide. In October 1980, after publicly launching an anti-drug campaign, Gil happened to drive past a New York newsroom. In the dim parking lot, he noticed Brenda's blue Plymouth sitting there, still and silent. Something made him stop. From the driver's seat, he spotted a crumpled manuscript lying on the dashboard, an article that painted him as a pompous hypocrite. The editor who had mocked him for years had written it. But resting on top of those pages was a fresh note, scribbled in a single careless line. "My love, I'm coming over tonight." He didn't have to walk inside. Across the street, beneath the cold glow of a streetlight, Gil saw everything he needed to see. Brenda leaned her head gently on the shoulder of that same editor, the man who had humiliated him again and again. She slipped her arms around his neck and kissed him, long enough for strangers to slow down and stare. Gil said nothing. He quietly lowered himself onto the curb, pulled out his notebook, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped his pen. As the light washed across his face, something inside him collapsed. In that moment, Gil understood. Tonight, he had lost more than love. He had lost his faith. And that was the first night he began writing to the bottle. Maybe Gil Scott-Heron knew what it felt like to lose face on a rain-soaked New York night. But Chuck Berry endured something quieter and far more brutal. September 12, 1969. The final roar of applause still echoed through the Nashville Municipal Auditorium. Backstage, Chuck stood alone, a snapped guitar string still curled in his fist, a tiny fracture after a flawless show. He pulled back the curtain just enough to look out one last time. And that's when he saw them. His wife, Thea. Arm in arm with the band's newest bass player, a kid barely old enough to remember Chuck's first hit, almost 20 years younger than her. The same young man who once lowered his head in reverence, calling him an idol. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. They walked shoulder to shoulder into the night, toward the parking lot, toward something unspoken. Minutes later, inside his dressing room, Chuck opened his wife's suitcase. Inside was a brown-covered notebook. Dates. Motel names. Room numbers. The first entry, April 2, 1969, the very day he had finished his European tour. Every line was a quiet confession. He didn't confront her. He didn't scream. Because sometimes the truth is so sharp, you'd rather bleed slowly than face it all at once. In the years that followed, the king of rock and roll changed. He installed hidden cameras in his recording studio. He isolated himself on his tour bus. Trust became a locked door with no spare key. Fame surrounded him, but closeness never did. And until his final days, he would murmur the same line to an old bandmate, a sentence heavy with everything he never said. "I'm not sure where they went that night, but it definitely wasn't back to me." Luther Ingram. Luther Ingram never walked in on a scandal. He didn't see betrayal in its loudest, ugliest form. What he witnessed was quieter, and somehow, far more devastating. On the night of March 4, 1977, Luther drove back to Memphis after 3 grueling weeks on tour. It was nearly 3 a.m. when he eased open the door to his small wooden house, expecting what he always longed for after the road, his wife waking up, smiling, wrapping her arms around him. Instead, he heard a man's voice drifting softly from the bedroom. A familiar melody. A chorus Luther himself had written for their wedding day. He moved closer. Through the slightly open door, he saw his wife sitting at the edge of the bed. Her hand was tightly clasped in the hands of the local pastor, the very man who had once blessed their marriage. An open Bible rested on their laps. Beneath it, a crumpled piece of paper with a single line written across it. "Please forgive me." March 4, 1977. Luther stood there for a long time. He didn't shout. He didn't confront. He simply closed the door, quietly. The next morning he walked into the studio and, in just 3 hours, wrote, "If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right." For the rest of his life, he never spoke about that night. No one dared to ask why, out of all his songs, that one carried no dedication. Near the end of his life, he finally said just one thing. "There are things forgiveness cannot save." Otis Redding, a man who carried betrayal to his grave. Some heartbreaks don't explode. They don't scream. They don't shatter glass. They settle quietly into the soul and stay there forever. For Otis Redding, it wasn't a dramatic scene of catching someone in the act. It was something colder, quieter. The slow, crushing realization that he had somehow become a stranger in the life of the woman he loved most. On October 14, 1966, after 7 long hours driving from Georgia to Memphis, Otis arrived at the studio unannounced. The hallway was dim, but the control room glowed under soft yellow lights. He stopped outside the glass window. Inside, his wife sat in a leather chair. Her head rested gently on the shoulder of a young piano player, someone Otis had once mentored, someone he trusted. They weren't kissing. There was no dramatic embrace. Just fingers intertwined tightly over a sheet of music. The song on the stand was "These Arms of Mine," the very song he had written for her the year they married. And in the corner of that page, scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "Take 3 for us." October 14, 1966. In that silent moment, everything he believed about loyalty dissolved. He didn't burst through the door. He didn't demand answers. He didn't make a sound. He simply stood there a few seconds longer, then gently closed the hallway door so they would never know he had seen. 3 months later, on December 10, 1967, the plane carrying Otis to a concert crashed into the icy waters of Lake Monona, ending his life at just 26 years old. In the wreckage, inside his suitcase, investigators found an unsealed envelope. There was no anger, no accusations, no bitterness. Just 4 trembling words, written diagonally in blue ink. "I knew everything. Wilson Pickett, the King of Soul, was undone not by a rival, not by the press, but by a simple cassette tape." And if every humiliation before that night had stripped away pieces of his pride, this was the one that shattered what little remained. The fierce voice that once set late-night stages on fire would soon fall silent before something smaller than his own hand, yet more devastating than any rumor. On November 2, 1974, he drove through the darkness from Dallas to Nashville after 3 relentless weeks on tour. Exhausted, hollow, all he wanted was to see his wife waiting on the couch, just like she always had. But when he opened the door, the soft glow of a table lamp revealed a different scene. Lucille sat curled in her nightgown, clutching an old cassette player. From its tiny speakers spilled the slurred, alcohol-soaked laughter of a young man. On the coffee table lay a stranger's gray shirt beside an empty vodka bottle. Scattered across the floor were crumpled love letters, some still sealed, letters Wilson had written back when he had nothing but hope and a dream. He didn't shout. He didn't ask questions. He simply bent down, picked up the tape, and slipped it into his breast pocket. The next morning, Wilson left Nashville. He walked away from a contract waiting to be signed, from a band waiting in rehearsal, from a future that had seemed certain just hours before. After that night, he vanished for weeks. Recording deals stalled. Whispers of divorce echoed through Nashville. Not long after, Lucille filed. The assets were divided. The apartment they once called home was emptied of everything but memories. In the years that followed, the king of soul lost his rhythm. Alcohol replaced applause. Fights replaced standing ovations. His once blazing career dimmed slowly, painfully, until all that remained at the end of his life was an old cassette tape with his wife's name on it, a quiet relic of a humiliation no one dared to speak aloud. And when you step back and look at stories like this, you start to notice a pattern. Behind the fame, the platinum records, the roaring crowds, these legends were still just men. Lonely, vulnerable, betrayed by the very people they trusted most. For decades, they buried their shame so the world could keep celebrating their glory. The public saw the spotlight. They never saw the darkness behind the curtain. Bitter divorces, alcoholism, depression, careers unraveling. Sometimes it all began with the soft creak of a bedroom door opening. If any of the truths in today's story shocked you, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the next story may reveal secrets even deeper than this one.